wizard tried to poison us.
Be quiet. I didn't mean to scare you tonight. None of us could ever imagine the horrors you must have endured.
Doing frail man's bidding.
Thus, nice and dark, yes. But where? Oh, slimy little
Over the past week or so, I've had a few of my friends genuinely express their concern for my mental well-being after they found out I was spending my precious time, precious, playing through the ill-fated Lord of the Rings game, Gollum. It's a game I'm sure everyone heard about last year, as it was Metacritic's worst game of the year, even though I think the subsequent releases of that Skull Island game and The Walking Dead Destinies look a lot worse than Gollum, neither of which I have played and don't plan to. Just yet.
Don't tempt me further.
Naturally, the one question I got from my friends when I told them I was playing through Gollum was,
but why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
And I guess I just have something of a fascination with bad games, to the point where I have to experience them myself. Or at least, that's what I'm trying to tell myself. I actually ignored quite a lot of the fuss that was made about Gollum when it launched last year, as the very idea of trying to make a video game about Gollum was just confusing to me. We've had a number of pretty good Lord of the Rings games over the years, with the PS2 movie tie-ins being remembered quite fondly by a lot of people, and the recent Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor games I thought were quite a bit of fun. But those were action games where you played as heroic characters like Aragorn and Gandalf, or Troy Baker doing his best Sean Bean impression while fighting through armies of orcs. Where was the audience that was clamoring to play as Gollum, famous for spending 400 years in a cave disassociating, eating raw fish, and then falling into a volcano?
Wieners, shut up!
So my initial reaction to hearing about Gollum not being great was like, oh, the Gollum game isn't very good? Wow, what a surprise. A hobbit farming simulator would have made more sense to me before a game where you play as Gollum. But I ended up watching Video Game Donkey's video on it, and realised that those 6 minutes weren't going to be enough for me. I had to play the Smeagol game myself. In that video, Donkey said that there are funny bad games, Goat Simulator being a great example, and then there are sad bad games. Gollum is most definitely a sad bad game, even more so than I realised after finishing it and started doing some research on the game's development.
You worm, again. Why don't you find some place to go die?
Yes, precious. Let's leave nice woman alone and say nothing.
So, The Lord of the Rings Gollum was developed by a German studio called Daedalic Entertainment, who had primarily found success creating 2D point-and-click adventure games. But after a few costly attempts at transitioning into new game styles, specifically full 3D games, the studio found itself in a tight spot with the future looking uncertain. Which is where Gollum comes into the picture, as Daedalic Entertainment managed to secure a license deal with the Tolkien estate in 2018, and were then very quick to announce Gollum in early 2019, with a release date planned for 2021. Funnily enough, according to the developers, other ideas were considered, like a classic adventure game following Aragorn and Gandalf, but for some reason they decided to go with the idea of telling a story from Gollum's perspective. The acquisition of the Tolkien license and the announcement of Gollum was a motivation boost for the relatively unknown studio, who had AAA ambitions for the project. They were very excited to be working within the world of Tolkien, as I think anyone would be, and in the developer videos for Gollum on the official PlayStation channel, it does appear that these guys were passionate about what they were doing. And this was the impression I was inferring as I played through Gollum, since it didn't feel like a deliberately bad, low-effort asset flip game like you see all across Steam. Some of the environments seen through the game aren't actually that bad, particularly in the second half of the game set in the Mirkwood Elven realms.
Games? Oh, we love games, doesn't we, precious? Does it like games? Does it?
The reason Gollum turned out so abysmal, sadly, is due to an unfortunate series of internal issues within the studio, in regards to the game's ambition and budget, and the core design philosophy of the developers who had never made a game on this kind of scale, or of this particular style. As I said, Daedalic Entertainment primarily had found success with 2D point-and-click games. Games like Uncharted and Tomb Raider were made by studios with at least twice the programmers and designers working on them than Daedalic, probably more likely 3 times, and had significantly larger budgets, with Gollum reportedly only having a budget of 15 million, which is not sufficient for a AAA title. It's also worth noting that studios like Naughty Dog are comprised of designers and artists that are very experienced with developing 3D AAA games, whereas Daedalic Entertainment wasn't. Daedalic then made the critical mistake of approaching Lord of the Rings Gollum with the same design philosophy they used with their other games, which is the top-down game theory. Basically, this design approach is when you come up with the story and world building first, and then try to design mechanics and gameplay systems that could work with the story you're telling. It's not a bad design theory, and it served them well when they were making point-and-click games, and The Last of Us was designed in some degree with this approach. Although I think Naughty Dog had a much clearer idea of what kind of game they would be making from the get-go. It was obviously going to be a third-person shooter of some sort.
Oh, bet it was nice.
The issue that Daedalic clearly ran into with this approach is that a number of the ideas and gameplay systems they created ended up not being very good, but due to the lack of a sufficient budget, there just wasn't the time and the resources to go back and rethink certain areas of the game, even though it was delayed twice, from September 2001 to May 2023. When you then factor in major internal management issues where workers allegedly weren't being paid for overtime, young interns were being underpaid, and just a generally toxic work environment, that sounds like another game I looked at quite a long time ago. It's almost kind of a miracle that Gollum even launched in the state it was in. Of course, none of this information changes the fact that the Smeagol game is a deeply underwhelming and sometimes broken experience, but learning that my hunch about the development being so troubled was in fact correct made me reflect on Gollum with more sadness. It really is a sad, bad game, and it would be incredibly easy to just dunk on this game as many others had without clear context. But nonetheless, let's take a look at the journey that I went on playing through the Gollum game.
What is it, Precious? What is it?
So, what exactly is the Smeagol game, you ask? The basic premise is that it attempts to tell the story of what happened when Gollum was imprisoned by Sauron in the pits of Mordor, after he unsuccessfully tried to catch a beetle. I'm not kidding. And the events that led to his escape from the elves in Mirkwood and the Fellowship of the Ring. As a game, it's primarily a platforming game reminiscent of some PS2 titles like Prince of Persia and Jak and Daxter, mixed with stealth gameplay and occasional puzzle solving. The kind of damning caveat to this being that you're playing as Gollum, and that so much of the game is really poorly designed and extremely unpolished, making it at the best of times just kind of boring, and at the worst of times utterly frustrating. Now, I didn't pay full retail price for the Smeagol game. I waited quite a while to find a Steam code for a pretty cheap price, and then I started playing through the PC version. To my shock and utter dismay, the PC port does not run well or look particularly great on my PC, even though I can run games like Red Dead Redemption 2 and Uncharted 4 just fine. Although 2023 was the year of terrible PC ports, so I'm not gonna hold that against Smeagol too much. I turned down most of the graphics settings to at least get it playable, which sucked because I really wanted to experience Gollum as it was intended, with ray tracing. I played my way through the first 3 or so chapters of the game, and was finding my reaction to the experience surprisingly passive. The game wasn't fun, but nothing that I was playing felt like it was broken or buggy, and it certainly didn't feel like one of the worst games ever made. Some of the platforming sections were a tad confusing to navigate, but I didn't see any massive issues in terms of glitches and bugs. Cause a lot of what I'd heard about the game was that it was a broken, borderline unplayable game in places, with one reviewer saying that it crashed on them so many times they gave up until it was patched. Then I remembered I was playing the game months after launch, where it had received a number of patches, with the version 2.2 patch notes being quite an extensive list of game fixes. This happened to really pique my curiosity, as now I wanted to see what the game was like in its release build, which unfortunately I was unable to do with the Steam release since it automatically downloads with the latest patches installed. I guess I probably could have pirated a launch version of the game, but instead, I decided that the next logical thing for me to do on this journey was to buy the game again.
What did you say?
You heard me right. I bought The Lord of the Rings Gollum twice. I went out and bought a physical copy of the PlayStation 4 release, since the disc contains the launch version, and I started the game again.
Fair enough.
The first thing I noticed immediately was that the title screen is a little bit different in the launch version, with the camera being much closer to the very sad looking model of Gollum in this cave, compared to the subsequent patches that pull the camera out further, which does look nicer. Once I got into playing through the game again, outside of the user interface being a little different, I was honestly kind of hard pressed to notice any glaring differences between this version and the one I had played on Steam. I think some of the animation for climbing might have been a little jankier, but it seemed like mostly the same game to me. Of course, there was still an extremely evident lack of polish, with the Candleman humorously having facial animations very reminiscent of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. I genuinely laughed at the clumsy implementation of these sprite-based characters rendered in this backdrop early in the game, and there were a few instances where the camera was a bit jittery, or just chose to focus on the wrong parts of a character in a cutscene. It wasn't until near the end of Chapter 4 that I actually came across a real game-breaking bug, during the sequence where you have to follow the Candleman's daughter without being spotted. I died about halfway through the sequence and restarted at a checkpoint early on. Only now, part of the level geometry at this particular point had completely disappeared, which caused me to die again. And this then caused an infinite loop where I'd respawn here every time the checkpoint reloaded and I'd die instantly. I only managed to fix this by restarting the entire level, which, you know, is great fun. I carried on playing for a little bit further into Chapter 5 because my original insane plan was to play through the entirety of Gollum twice. Once through the launch version and then again through the final version 2.2 patch.
There's bravery, and then there's just plain stupidity.
But I kind of figured at this point that there probably wasn't going to be that many glaring differences between the two versions. So I took the disc out and popped it into my shiny new PlayStation 5 and got the free upgrade to the PS5 version. Which means that, technically speaking, I own 3 copies of Gollum now.
We love games, doesn't we, precious?
But you know what? I think it was worth it, because now I got to play through the Smeagol game with ray tracing, and see, look at these gorgeous RTX effects on the water. It almost makes you forget that this is a terrible game for a second. Oh, and the PS5 version also supports hair simulation effects for Gollum, which apparently broke earlier versions of the game. I don't really know what it does though, apart from this, I guess.
That remains to be seen.
But I did end up finishing the entire game playing through the PS5 version, and collectively across the 3 versions of Gollum I played, I think I spent about 45 hours with our dear friend Smeagol here.
Fair enough.
Now, I do want to say that I didn't have an entirely miserable experience playing through the Smeagol game. There are some competently designed sequences scattered throughout the game, where the mechanics work just fine, uninspired though they may be. There is some neat choose-your-way adventure mechanics in the story where you can change the fate of certain characters, like sacrificing the Frail Man or the Cruel Orc in Chapter 2. One odd sequence where you have to breed a bird in Chapter 4 led to an orc later on remarking about the choice of bird I'd bred.
Hey, where are you going?
Master wants to train our bird some more.
You better. It's a wild one. I told you, the white ones are elvish.
There was definitely some hope on the developer's part that you'd want to play through the game twice, like I almost did, with the Smeagol vs Gollum debate mechanic, where you can argue various decisions in the game from the perspective of either persona. The incentive being, outside of the mesmerizing story, that there are 2 trophies you can unlock for playing through the game fully as Smeagol or Gollum.
Fair enough.
The entire second half of the game was quite a surprise to me, since I avoided a lot of the outrage and general coverage of the game around launch, and I was under the impression that the entire game took place in Mordor, when in actual fact Smeagol escapes in Chapter 6 and is then taken in by the elves in Mirkwood, which purely from a visual standpoint was a massive improvement for the game. There are a handful of artistically impressive sections in the Mordor half of the game, but they pale compared to some of the environments in the second half of the game, which are blooming with lush colours and are honestly quite picturesque. The game's soundtrack is also not bad at all, and quite fitting with the tone of the story and the locations you explore. It's just a shame that they're not enough to distract from the fact that you are playing as Gollum, who, in spite of being taken in by elves who generally are nice to him by feeding him and offering him shelter, decides that he desperately needs to escape from them in order to get back to his very busy schedule of sabotaging his own life. Even if this was somehow a really engaging story that was based on some long-lost manuscript penned by J.R.R. Tolkien himself, the overall sloppy game design and mechanics would still make this game feel like a chore to play.
Here we go. That boring story again.
The Mordor sections of the game are just an absolute slog to get through, with many mechanics introduced that you only do once or twice, like herding cattle beasts or escorting a companion. Most of the first half of the game just has you following someone for a while, then you go off and do some inane fetch quest style objective like collecting dead slave tags, igniting bombs in the mines, or feeding creatures. It's just a weird mess of half-baked ideas, loosely thread together with the narrative and core gameplay mechanics of stealth and platforming. But even these core systems aren't that great either.
Regards.
You! Stop!
The stealth gameplay, which conceptually actually makes a lot of sense for a Gollum game, is some of the most bare-bones stealth you can find in a game, with most sequences simply requiring you to hide in bushes, duck out of sight when an enemy's sight gauge appears, and throwing rocks at distractible items. And failure rewards you with these very impressive capture animations.
Yes, do it again, do it again.
One of these sequences was actually kind of intense as you sneaked around spiders in Shelob's lair, but that was probably due to my fear of giant spiders more than anything. The core gameplay loop, I guess you'd call it, is the platforming gameplay as you traverse across the many environments in the game. I never like to use the insult "this looks like a PlayStation 2 game", since many of the best games of all time are in fact PS2 games. But yeah, a lot of the platforming sequences in the Smeagol game are very reminiscent of PS2 era platforming games, most notably the Prince of Persia games I think, with Smeagol somehow being able to perform acrobatic feats like wall running. Some of these platforming stages, particularly in the second half of the game, aren't actually all that bad, but there is something kind of ridiculous about how they look with this PS2 era type of design, with Gollum vaulting up ledges as if he has the same upper body strength as Nathan Drake. Some stages are a little bit open-ended with a few different routes you can take, which is usually pretty cool in a game. The last two Uncharted games adopted this wide linear approach with a few of its levels. The issue is that a number of the levels in Gollum aren't designed particularly well and are often vague and confusing to try and navigate, with it often not being obvious what is climbable and what isn't, resulting in a number of really tragic leaps of faith. There was one part here in Chapter 5 where I legitimately had no clue where I was supposed to go, so I just kinda glitched my way down on some of the environmental geometry.
Fair enough.
This is all compounded further by just the general imprecise nature and response of the controls. I lost count of the number of times I plummeted Smeagol to his premature death because he wouldn't trigger into the wall run animation when I pressed R2 on the wall he was meant to run across. I spent like 5 minutes here in this Elven Tower because I couldn't get him to trigger both the wall run animation and the following backwards jump he needed to perform to get up to the next part of the tower. Even just trying to get Gollum to perform the standard jumping sections often felt like they came down to pure luck, that he wasn't going to completely overshoot the platform he was meant to land on. And even if he did land on it, there was every chance the landing momentum would make him run off the edge. And then sometimes, if you were lucky, the game would trigger a leap animation where Smeagol would reach out and grab the ledge in front of him. Or other times he would just drop to his death. By the way, there's an achievement for beating this game without dying too. Funnily enough, it was during my playthrough of the PS5 version that these issues became a lot more glaring to me, perhaps due in part to the fact that this was my third playthrough of some of these parts of the game.
I'll be alright, just let me sit quietly for a moment.
These sloppy controls can be irritating during the regular gameplay, but they become downright infuriating during a couple of the game's action set pieces, I guess you would call them. There's a sequence in Chapter 6 that is very reminiscent of Crash Bandicoot, that sees you running away from the giant spider Shelob. That was a headache-inducing series of trial and error, as I tried to figure out what was the optimal route to take, combined with the many instances of Smeagol not triggering his wall run animation. It also didn't help that there was a random chance every time I reloaded the checkpoint that Smeagol would respawn facing the wrong direction from where I was meant to go. I didn't even notice until like after 15 attempts that there was actually this green slime stuff on the ground that you were meant to follow, that highlighted when to jump and which direction to turn. Another sequence in Chapter 9 saw you quickly trying to navigate through a series of platform challenges as orcs were chasing and firing arrows at you. That again took many attempts due to Gollum not triggering the wall run animations, or just jumping incorrectly to his death.
You have to be kidding.
I will say that for what it's worth, the game does actually get better in the second half, and it kind of finds a groove to it, with the stealth and platforming becoming a much tighter focus than it was during the Mordor sections. But the imprecise controls and the vague nature of some of the challenges presented quickly remind you that you are playing a remarkably subpar game. And the thing is that even if the gameplay mechanics were more polished, I still don't think that it would have made this a much better game overall. Maybe it would have been less frustrating to play through, sure, that would have been nice, but it still would have been a rather boring adventure where you have to play as Gollum being a miserable slave in Mordor, and then continuing to be a miserable little Cretchen to the elves who take him in and try to be nice to him. I'm hard pressed to come up with a scenario where you could make a game about playing as Gollum work and be somewhat interesting or fun to play. Maybe a mobile game where Gollum challenges you to a series of riddles, perhaps?
If Baggins loses, we eat it whole.
The ending does try to create a scenario where Smeagol played an integral role in preventing Sauron from obtaining some kind of elven magic, but it just feels a bit silly. I think there was a reason that Tolkien glossed over what happened to Smeagol briefly in the book. And the ending just reinforces what a miserable character he is, since the final Smeagol versus Gollum decision is whether or not to kill the bird that you raised in Mordor. And then he gets himself trapped in the mines of Moria because he doesn't know how to open the entrance door. And then knowing what would subsequently happen to the developers who lost their jobs trying to make their ambitious idea of a AAA Smeagol game come to fruition just makes me even sadder.
Smeagol's life is a sad story.
So at the end of all this, I'm not entirely sure what the lesson is here. We've all learnt that I make terrible decisions with my money. As I said, I do find bad games to be quite fascinating. I've played Duke Nukem Forever and Aliens Colonial Marines a few times, and I thought that The Walking Dead Survival Instinct had a few neat ideas buried underneath its shonky execution. But ultimately, what I think it is about the Smeagol game that just had me so compelled to want to experience it is just because the entire premise of playing as Gollum to me was just such a flawed concept to start with, and I needed to see how it all came together in the end. It's definitely not the worst game I've ever played. There are some half-decent sequences sprinkled throughout, and it's evident that Daedalic Entertainment were passionate about what they were trying to do. Probably overly ambitious as it were, considering the concept and the internal studio issues they were facing. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend this game to anyone, it's not great. There is actually a free trial of the first hour of the game on PlayStation Plus if you're still on the fence about buying it, or perhaps want to try and speedrun through the game in an hour. Apparently people have done this. Will I ever play it again? Probably, yeah. I could stupidly see myself going through it again at some stage to get some of the other achievements. If you are curious to know more about what happened during the development of Gollum, there is an interesting video on the German YouTube channel Game 2 called Why Gollum Had To Fail, which I'll leave a link to in the description. Anyways, this has been my experience with the Smeagol game, and I hope you've enjoyed watching my journey through that experience. If you have also played through Gollum, do leave a comment and tell me what you thought. Perhaps we could start a I played through Gollum support group.
What? No, wait. We do not want any adventures here. Thank you, not today.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and as always, stay safe out there everyone. Don't go around chasing beetles near the Mordor outskirts, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Precious!
Be careful. Don't break a leg.
disguises.